To begin setting up classes and student accounts, click on the Classes page. You'll find a list of classes you've already created. Here's an example class we can look at together first. You'll see a student roster with a list of student usernames, and then above that you'll see a list of lab report assignments that I've assigned to my students. Here's one on color and temperature of objects, and above that is a one on light intensity. The lab report assignment dashboard shows the progress of the students as they work through the lab report. For this lab report assignment, I divided up the class into two groups. Group 1 had Catherine and Albert in it, and Group 2 had Thomas and Marie in it. You can see from the progress on their dashboard that Group 1 is farther along than Group 2. I can click See Lab Report to now open that lab report and view it, which opens up a copy of the lab report that the students have been working on. This lab report asks a simple question: how will light intensity change when the lights are turned on and off? And Albert and Catherine in the group have made hypotheses and written their answers here in the hypothesis section. As a teacher, you can add comments to give students feedback or further instructions. You can add images and videos for them to look at. And here you can see some data that they've collected. Here's trial 1. At the bottom, you can see that Catherine has started to write a conclusion. As a teacher, I can monitor their progress, give them feedback, and then, when they turn it in, provide a grade. Now let's go ahead and see how we can create a class and student accounts in the first place. To create a new class, return to your Classes page, and from there, click on the Create New Class button in the upper right corner. You'll then be able to enter in some basic information of your class. Here, we're going to enter in a class name, Physical Science. I can then enter the period, subject, and room number if I want to. We're going to say this is period 3, subject science, room 102. Students will need a class code and their username to log in. If this box is checked, they will also need a student code to log in, which is unique to them. By default, this option is checked, but you can disable it if you'd like. Click Create. And now my physical science class has been added. Click on it to open it. You'll see that there are no students in my roster yet and no lab report assignments. To add students to my roster and create student accounts, click Add Student. Here I can add student usernames to the roster. I just need to have each username on a different line. For example, I can type in Marie C and then Albert E on a different line. When I click OK, these student accounts will now be created, and those students will be added to my roster, Albert and Marie. For Albert to log in now, he needs to use this username, Albert E, along with this student code to log in. You can also create new student accounts by copying and pasting names from a roster. Here I have an example roster set up in Google Sheets. I just need to highlight all the names and then copy them, and then I can paste them directly into the Add Students dialog. This will create new usernames for each one of those students. Just make sure all of those names are on a separate line. This process of adding students to your roster is what creates student accounts. The students will then need 3 things to log in to their new PocketLab Notebook account. Click Show Codes to see those 3 things. They'll need their username, a class code, which is the same for all students in the class, and then a student code, which is a little like a password. The student code is unique to each student. If you don't want students to need a student code, then make sure you disable the student code checkbox when you create a new class. You can always view the login information that students will need here by clicking Student Codes and then Show. You can also download a CSV file of the student login information by clicking Download. This can be helpful for creating handouts for students with their login information. To begin assigning lab report assignments to your students, go to the Lab Report Assignment section and click Add Lab Report. You'll see a list of all the lab reports in your lab report library. You can assign any of these to your classes. Here we will assign the Magnets Act Like Springs lab report. If I click on it, it is now in my class as an assignment. Before this assignment is sent to students, I still need to select whether I want this to be worked on in lab groups or assigned to students individually. To do that, click on the lab report assignment, and then you'll have an option to click either individual work or lab groups. Let's try both. We'll start with individual work. Click on it, and now your lab report is assigned to all of the students in your class for them to work on individually. I'll go ahead and assign another lab report assignment so we can see what it looks like when we use lab groups. Let's click on this color and temperature of objects. I now select lab groups instead of individual work. Here, click on Add Lab Group to begin assigning students into different lab groups. In Group 1, I click on the students in the group and I get a drop-down menu of all the students in the roster. I select which students I want in the group. I've created Group 1 with 4 different students. Now, to click and add another group, I click Add Lab Group and add students into Group 2. Now I have 2 lab groups with 4 students in each group. I now click Done to send the lab reports to the students. This time, however, the students in each group will be able to work together on the same lab report copy. You don't have to create new lab groups every time you want to do group work in your class. If I click Add Lab Reports and create a new assignment, and then I click Lab Groups, you'll see now there's an option to use previous lab groups. If I click on that, it automatically brings in the lab groups that I created for the last lab report assignment. I can still then move students around from different lab groups if I need to. Here I'm making some last-minute adjustments to Group 1 and Group 2 by switching a couple students. When I click Done, those lab reports are now sent to the students in those groups. Now let's log in as one of the students to see what things look like from their perspective. If I click Student Login, and then I enter the class code that I was given by my teacher, I'll then need to enter my student username. Here we'll enter Albert E. and a student code if required. Click Login. I'm now logged in as a student. If I click Lab Reports, I'll see all the lab reports that have been assigned to me. Here I can see all 3 lab reports that we assigned to the class as a teacher. If I click on the Magnets Act Like Springs lab report, I will see the lab report that I need to work on individually. As I work through the lab report, I can check off these Mark as Complete buttons, which will indicate to the teacher how far along I am in the lab report. I can watch videos, read background information, and down here you'll see there's a section called Hypothesis where I can click Answer and write in my hypothesis that predicts the answer to the investigation question. I can then continue to move through my lab report, clicking Mark as Complete as I do different sections, looking at images that might help me set up my experiment. And here in the Collect Data section, I can click to connect to a PocketLab and record data. Here I can create a scatter plot, and at the end, I can add my own text section to write out my conclusion. Now let's go back and look how the teacher sees all this. I'm now back viewing this as a teacher. Here in my lab report assignments, I can see that Albert has completed a few different sections, and I can click on the button See Lab Reports to look at his lab report copy. I can then look at his answer to the hypothesis and maybe add a comment. Albert will then see this comment when I add it to the lab report. Eventually, Albert can turn in his lab report when he is finished. Let's see how he does that. We'll go back to viewing this as a student, Albert. When Albert feels like he is finished with the lab report, he can click the Turn In button in the upper right corner. It'll ask if he's sure. If Albert turns it in, he can no longer edit or modify this lab report. It will be in read-only for him, and only the teacher can make adjustments. Albert can no longer add answers to question sections, add his own cards, or collect data. As a teacher, you can see exactly when Albert turned in his lab report. Let's look at that. Here I am logged in as a teacher again. I can see next to Albert's lab report it says turned in today at 2:14 p.m. I can click on that lab report to give Albert feedback and grade it. If I want Albert to go back and make any adjustments to his lab report, I can click in the upper right corner, Return to Student. If I click on this, Albert will now be able to edit his lab report again and make any adjustments. He can then turn it in again whenever he's ready. This is a great system for students to turn in their work, for you to get a timestamp of when it was turned in, and then if you have feedback for them, you can return it to the students for them to apply that feedback in a revision of their lab report. Those are the basics of creating a class, creating new student accounts, assigning students lab report assignments, and finally providing students feedback on their work.